Boy sells candy on the streets to care for his sick mother, but when a gangster shows up demanding money, everything falls apart until a millionaire crosses his path, and Pedro stood still, watching his mother sleep on the worn-out couch. Her face, pale and sunken, rested gently on the pillow, her breath shallow and uneven. The medicine bottle on the small table beside her was nearly empty, only a few pills rattling inside. He knew what that meant. He had to sell more sweets this week, no matter what. Every coin he earned was the difference between her taking the next dose or missing it. He clenched his fist so tightly his knuckles turned white. Failure wasn't an option. His mother needed him. There was no one else. Pedro grabbed his worn backpack from the floor, slinging it over one shoulder. He cast one last glance at Mrs. Clara before heading toward the door, trying to ignore the weight pressing on his chest. His heartbeat quickened as his thoughts drifted to Carlos, the local gangster. Since Carlos's first threat, Pedro lived in constant fear. It wasn't just that Carlos was dangerous. He was relentless, always lurking, always watching. Even when Pedro wasn't looking, it felt like Carlos's eyes were fixed on him, waiting for him to make a wrong move. Pedro stepped outside, trying to push the fear away, but it clung to him, like a cold hand gripping his neck. He knew he was taking a risk, going back to the same busy intersection where Carlos had found him before. He told himself there wasn't any other choice. The quieter streets hadn't brought in enough sales. If he didn't sell everything today, there would be no medicine tomorrow. As he reached the bustling intersection, he adjusted the basket of sweets in his hand. Focus, Pedro. One sale at a time. He began his routine, offering the homemade sweets to drivers stopped at the red light. Some waved him away without a word. Others smiled politely but shook their heads. But Pedro kept going, refusing to let frustration slow him down. He approached a sleek black car, the driver's window sliding down just as Pedro reached it. A familiar face greeted him. Edward, the same man in the expensive suit who had bought sweets the other day. You again! Edward's voice carried a lightness, as if running into Pedro felt like bumping into an old friend. His smile was genuine, the kind that stood out in a city where everyone seemed in a rush to be somewhere else. How's the business today, young man? Pedro hesitated for a moment. He forced a small smile, though the weight of everything happening at home made it difficult to keep it steady. Try my best, sir. One sweet at a time. Edward's eyes softened, and he nodded approvingly. That's the spirit. Without another word, Edward reached into his pocket and pulled out a wallet. He handed Pedro a crisp bill, a sum larger than what the sweets cost. Pedro's eyes widened as he stared at the note. I can't take this, sir. It's too much. Edward tilted his head, his smile unwavering. Think of it as an investment in your future. He gave Pedro a quick wink, just as the traffic light turned green. Before Pedro could say anything else, Edward's car pulled away, leaving him standing there, clutching the money in disbelief. Hope stirred inside him, but it was laced with anxiety. As Pedro pocketed the cash, the sense of relief was short-lived. A sharp, sneering voice cut through the noise of the street, freezing him in place. Well, look who couldn't follow orders. Pedro's heart sank. He turned slowly and saw Carlos, standing a few feet away on the sidewalk. The gangster's cold, predatory eyes locked onto Pedro like a hunter sizing up his prey. Carlos wasn't alone. Two of his men, both taller and broader than Pedro, stood behind him like shadows. Carlos took a step closer, his lips curling into a smirk. "Where's my cut, kid?" His voice was low, but the threat in it was unmistakable. Pedro's hands trembled as he reached into his pocket, pulling out most of the money Edouard had given him. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat hammering home the helplessness he felt. He held out the money with both hands, as if surrendering might make the nightmare end. "This is all I have," Pedro stammered, his voice barely audible. "Please, I need the rest to buy medicine for my mom." Carlos took the money without even looking at it, crumpling the bills in his fist. His grin widened and the cruelty in his eyes deepened. "Not my problem, kid." Carlos's voice dripped with mockery. "Next time, I want more. And if you don't have it..." He leaned in closer, so close Pedro could smell the stale scent of cigarettes on his breath. "Things are gonna get ugly for you." "Got it." Pedro nodded, his throat too tight to form words. Carlos gave a satisfied chuckle, a dry and humorless sound. He turned to leave, motioning for his men to follow him. Pedro stood frozen on the sidewalk, his hands still trembling. He watched them walk away, disappearing into the crowd like phantoms. His chest felt tight, as if a heavy weight pressed down on him from all sides. What was he supposed to do now? He had given away almost everything he had earned. And even worse, Carlos would come back. The threat wasn't over. It was just beginning. He glanced down at the few coins still left in his hand. Barely enough to buy bread, let alone medicine. His vision blurred with tears, and for the first time in a long while, he felt truly lost. He wiped his face quickly, as if doing so could push away the hopelessness creeping into his heart. What would happen to his mother if he couldn't protect her? And where could he turn for help when there was no one to rely on but himself? Who is Edouard really? And why does he seem so interested in Pedro's life? Pedro stepped into the small house, closing the door behind him as quietly as possible, but the effort to conceal his emotions felt useless. His eyes burned, and the lump in his throat tightened with every step toward the tiny living room, where his mother lay. He had failed her again. Mrs. Clara rested on the couch, a threadbare blanket draped over her frail body. Even in her weakened state, she sensed a shift in her son's energy the moment he walked in. Slowly, she turned her head, her tired eyes meeting his. "Pedro, my love." Her voice was soft, but carried the kind of strength only a mother could summon. "What happened?" Pedro tried to smile, but it crumbled almost instantly. He bit his lip, holding back tears, but the weight of everything was too much. His chest heaved as he sank to his knees beside her. I couldn't..." He choked on the words. "Carlos took almost everything. The money from the sweets. I gave it to him." His voice cracked as he forced the truth out, shame clinging to every word. "I don't know what to do anymore, Mom. I'm trying, but it's not enough. It's never enough." Mrs. Clara's thin arms reached for him. Even with the little strength she had, her embrace was warm, familiar, and comforting, just as it had always been. Pedro rested his head on her chest, listening to her heart beating softly beneath her ribs. "Shoo," she whispered, running her hand gently through his hair. "We'll find a way, my son. I promise you, we will." But deep down, Pedro doubted it. How? How could they possibly overcome this? Carlos wouldn't stop, and every day, his mother's condition worsened. He had tried so hard, and yet it all seemed to be slipping through his fingers like sand. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Mrs. Clara just held him, rocking him gently as if he were still a small boy. Pedro clung to her warmth, knowing that it was the only thing keeping him from falling apart completely. But when he pulled away and looked into her eyes, he saw something that scared him more than Carlos's threats. She was getting weaker. He swallowed hard, wiping his face with the sleeve of his shirt. He needed a solution fast. The next day, Pedro returned to the busy intersection. He carried the same basket of sweets, though his heart felt heavier than ever. His hands were shaky, and he kept looking over his shoulder, half expecting Carlos to appear out of nowhere again. But he had no choice. He had to keep going. If he stayed home, his mother wouldn't get the medicine she needed. As he stood on the curb, watching cars slow down at the red light, he heard the familiar sound of a car window rolling down. Pedro turned toward the voice and saw Edward again, seated behind the wheel of his sleek black car. But this time, Edward's smile wasn't as playful as before. There was something more serious, concerned, in his expression. "Come here, kid," Edward said, motioning him closer. Pedro hesitated for a moment, but approached the car window. He could see now that Edward wasn't just here to buy sweets. His gaze lingered on Pedro, studying him closely, as if he could see through the boy's brave front. "You look worse today, Pedro. What's going on?" Edward asked, his voice steady but gentle. Pedro bit his lip, unsure if he should open up to a stranger, even one as kind as Edward. But there was something about the man, something steady and reassuring, that made Pedro feel like it was okay to talk. Pedro started, but the words caught in his throat. He looked down at his hands, twisting his fingers nervously. I'm in trouble, sir. Serious trouble." Edward leaned forward slightly, resting his elbow on the car door. "What kind of trouble?" Pedro looked around, making sure no one was watching. Then, with a deep breath, he told Edward everything. About Carlos, about the threats, about the way the gangster had taken nearly all the money Pedro had earned selling sweets. He spoke in a rushed, anxious stream, as if he needed to get the whole story out before the words failed him. "And my mom," Pedro added quietly, his voice breaking. "She's really sick. I need the money for her medicine. But now, with Carlos, I don't know what to do." Edward listened patiently, his expression never shifting. He waited until Pedro finished, taking in every word as if weighing the full gravity of the situation. Then, with a slow exhale, Edward leaned back in his seat. "You shouldn't have to go through this alone," he said at last, his voice firm but kind. "No kid your age should." Pedro blinked, caught off guard by the sincerity in Edward's words. "But what else can I do? If I stop selling here, we won't survive. And if I stay, Carlos will just come back." Edward tapped his fingers thoughtfully on the steering wheel. For a moment, it seemed like he was calculating something, formulating a plan. Then, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, pristine business card. "Meet me at this address after you're done here," Edward said, handing Pedro the card. "I think I can help." Pedro stared at the card in disbelief, turning it over in his fingers. It listed an office address in a part of the city he had never been to before. He glanced back up at Edward, confusion flickering across his face. "Why are you doing this?" Pedro asked, the question slipping out before he could stop himself. Edward smiled, though there was something solemn in his eyes. "Because I know what it's like to fight battles no one else sees," he said quietly. "And I don't believe in leaving good people behind." Pedro felt his throat tighten again, not with fear this time, but with something closer to hope. Could Edward really help him? Could this be the break he so desperately needed? "All right," Pedro whispered, nodding slowly. "I'll come." Edward gave him a reassuring look. "Good. I'll be waiting." The car window slid up, and Edward drove off, leaving Pedro standing on the curb with the business card still clutched in his hand. For the first time in what felt like forever, a glimmer of possibility flickered in Pedro's mind. But along with that glimmer came a new question. What did Edouard really want in return? Why was this man, someone who clearly had everything, so invested in helping a kid from the streets? What does Edouard really want from Pedro? And is his offer too good to be true? Pedro stood nervously at the entrance of the building Edouard had sent him to. It was like nothing he had ever seen before. A towering structure of glass and steel that gleamed under the city's relentless hustle. His hand clenched a crumpled business card, and for a moment, he considered turning back. But this was for his mother. He had no choice. With a deep breath, Pedro stepped inside. The lobby was grand, almost overwhelming. The floors gleamed, and the walls were decorated with elegant artwork. He felt out of place in his worn sneakers and old clothes. A woman at the front desk, dressed in a sleek uniform, gave him a polite smile. "Are you Pedro?" she asked, her tone professional but kind. Pedro nodded, too nervous to speak. "Mr. Edouard is expecting you. Follow me." He followed her through a wide corridor that seemed to stretch endlessly, the sound of their footsteps echoing. They stopped in front of a door, and the woman opened it with a smooth gesture. "This way," she said, motioning him in. Pedro stepped into a large, brightly lit office. The windows stretched from floor to ceiling, offering a breathtaking view of the city. The room smelled faintly of leather and coffee. And there, sitting behind an expansive desk, was Edouard. The man looked up from a few papers, smiled warmly, and stood. "Pedro, I'm glad you came," Edouard said, gesturing toward a chair. "Please sit down." Pedro shuffled forward and took a seat, gripping his knees to keep his hands from shaking. He felt small in that room, surrounded by luxury and power. Edouard leaned forward slightly, folding his hands on the desk. "Let's get straight to the point, Pedro," he began, his tone gentle but serious. "I want to help you and your mother. But before we move forward, I need to ask you something." Pedro's heart pounded in his chest. He could feel that whatever Edouard was about to say would change everything. "How far are you willing to go?" Edouard asked slowly, his gaze unwavering, "to turn your life around?" Pedro blinked, caught off guard by the weight of the question. There was something in Edouard's voice, not a threat, but a challenge. It was as if he was measuring Pedro, testing not just his resolve, but his spirit. Pedro hesitated for a moment, then met Edouard's gaze. "I'll do whatever it takes," he said, his voice steady despite the fear that churned inside him. Edouard smiled, a quiet approval in his eyes. "Good. That's what I needed to hear." He stood and walked around the desk, stopping just in front of Pedro. "Here's what I'm offering. I'll cover all the medical expenses for your mother. We'll move her to the best clinic in the city, where she'll get the treatment she needs." Pedro's heart raced. This was more than he had dared to hope for. "And that's not all," Edouard continued. "I'm also going to enroll you in a good school, one where you can focus on your education and stop worrying about money. You'll have a fresh start, Pedro. No more selling sweets on the streets. No more fear of Carlos or anyone else." Pedro could barely believe what he was hearing. It sounded too good to be real. He felt gratitude rising inside him, but with it came a flicker of doubt. "Why are you doing this?" Pedro asked quietly, unable to hold back the question any longer. Edouard smiled, though it was tinged with something more complex, something Pedro couldn't quite understand. "Because I see potential in you, Pedro," Edouard said. "I know what it's like to fight uphill battles, to feel trapped by circumstances beyond your control. Someone once gave me a chance when I was in a situation not too different from yours. Now, I'm doing the same." Pedro swallowed hard, overwhelmed by the kindness and opportunity being offered to him. But he couldn't ignore the lingering fear, the fear that nothing in life came without a price. "And what do you want from me, sir?" Pedro asked cautiously. Edouard's smile softened. "I only need one thing from you, Pedro. Stay strong. Stay committed. The road ahead won't be easy, but if you stay focused and keep moving forward, you'll make it." Pedro's eyes stung with unshed tears. "I won't let you down," he whispered. Edouard gave a small nod. "I know you won't." For a moment, there was silence between them, a shared understanding that this was the beginning of something new. Pedro knew his life was about to change, but it wasn't just relief that settled in his chest. There was a strange, gnawing feeling, like a question waiting to be answered. Why was Edouard really doing all of this? Was it just kindness, or was there something deeper behind his generosity? Pedro stood to leave, clutching the card Edouard had given him earlier. Just as he reached the door, Edouard's voice stopped him. "One last thing, Pedro," Edouard said. "I'll need you to start work with me part-time, just a few hours after school. You'll learn things that will be useful for your future." Pedro turned back, confused but curious. "Work? What kind of work?" Edouard smiled. "You'll see. It's nothing to worry about. It's all part of preparing you for the life you deserve." Pedro nodded slowly, though his mind was still swirling with questions. He had no idea what Edouard meant, but he was too grateful to ask more. "Thank you," Pedro said, his voice full of emotion. "Really, thank you for everything." Edouard gave him a reassuring nod. "Go take care of your mom, Pedro. I'll take care of the rest." With that, Pedro left the office, the door clicking softly behind him. As he walked down the long corridor and out of the gleaming building, a strange mix of hope and uncertainty filled his chest. This could be the break he so desperately needed. But why did it still feel like a gamble? What does Edouard really want from Pedro? And is Pedro prepared for the challenges that lie ahead? Pedro adjusted his work uniform, a plain button-up shirt and slacks that felt strange on him, like a costume borrowed from another life. It had only been a few weeks since Edouard enrolled his mother in the clinic and offered Pedro a part-time job at the company. But already his world felt different. Every morning, he juggled school and work, and though it was exhausting, he finally saw a future he could believe in. His mother was receiving proper care for the first time in months. Her face, once pale and gaunt, now showed signs of color again. Hope no longer felt like an illusion. At work, he spent afternoons organizing files, learning the basics of administration, and observing the dynamics of Edouard's business. Edouard himself checked in regularly, offering small bits of advice that made Pedro feel seen and valued. For the first time in a long while, the weight on Pedro's shoulders seemed manageable. But the boy had forgotten one thing. Carlos never let his prey escape so easily. The day had been long, and Pedro was tired. As the last few employees trickled out of the office building, Pedro shut down his computer, stretched his aching arms, and grabbed his backpack. He pushed open the glass doors of the building, ready to head home. But the moment he stepped onto the sidewalk, he knew something was wrong. A chill ran down his spine as he spotted Carlos leaning casually against the wall near the exit, his arms crossed over his chest. The man's eyes glinted with that same predatory look Pedro remembered all too well. Two of Carlos's goons stood behind him, their bulk casting long shadows on the pavement. Pedro froze, instinctively gripping the straps of his backpack tighter. How did Carlos find him here? He thought he had escaped this nightmare, that the life Edouard had given him would keep him safe. But here they were, waiting. Carlos straightened, stepping away from the wall with a slow, deliberate movement. "So, you thought you could disappear on me, huh?" Carlos said, his voice dripping with mockery. His smile was the kind that didn't reach his eyes. It was sharp and dangerous. Pedro took a step back, but one of the goons shifted closer, blocking any chance of retreat. I don't have anything for you," Pedro stammered, his voice cracking. Carlos's hand shot out, grabbing Pedro by the collar of his shirt and yanking him forward. Pedro gasped, struggling to free himself. But Carlos's grip was like iron. "You think I care about that?" Carlos snarled, his face inches from Pedro's. "You owe me, kid, and I always get what's mine." Pedro squirmed, panic flooding his chest. "Please, I don't have any money. I'm just trying to..." Carlos silenced him with a cruel smile. "Don't care, boy." His grip tightened on Pedro's shirt, pulling him closer. "If you don't pay up, your mom's the one who'll suffer." Pedro's heart stopped. The mention of his mother hit him like a punch to the gut. Carlos knew exactly how to hurt him. "Leave her out of this," Pedro shouted, his voice louder now, fueled by a burst of desperate anger. "She's sick. She hasn't done anything to you." Carlos tilted his head, pretending to consider Pedro's words. Then he chuckled, a low, menacing sound that made Pedro's skin crawl. "That's the point, boy. Sick people are easy targets. If you don't start paying me again, let's just say, bad things happen when people miss their medication." Pedro's fists clenched at his sides, frustration bubbling inside him. How could this man be so heartless? His mind raced, trying to think of a way out, but nothing came. "You have no idea what I can do," Carlos whispered, leaning in so only Pedro could hear. "Run from me again, and it won't just be her that suffers." The world seemed to close in around Pedro. He felt like a cornered animal, trapped with no way out. Every dream, every glimpse of hope he had started to build since Edouard entered his life, all of it now hung by a thread. Carlos gave him a hard shove, and Pedro stumbled backward, nearly losing his balance. One of the goons let out a laugh, amused by the sight of the boy scrambling to steady himself. "You have until the end of the week, Pedro," Carlos said, his voice calm but laced with menace. "Find me some cash. If you don't, well, you know what happens." Pedro stared at them, breathing hard, his hands shaking with anger and helplessness. The three men turned and walked away, disappearing into the night like predators retreating after marking their prey. For a few moments, Pedro stood frozen in place, his mind swirling with fear and frustration. Why now? Why? When everything was finally starting to go right, he fought back the tears threatening to well up in his eyes. Crying wouldn't solve anything. He had to think. He had to act. Pedro's legs felt heavy as he made his way back inside the building, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know what to do. He couldn't tell Edouard, could he? Edouard had already done so much for him and his mother. Would Edouard even believe him? Or worse, what if involving Edouard made things even more dangerous? Pedro reached the elevator and leaned against the cold metal wall, trying to steady his breathing. His phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message from the clinic, an update on his mother's condition. She was stable for now, but the treatment needed to continue without interruption. He couldn't let her down. But how was he supposed to protect her from Carlos and pay off the gangster at the same time? The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, and Pedro stepped out, feeling more lost than ever. He needed help, but the only person he could think to ask was Edouard. Could he really bring this problem to Edouard? Would it be fair to drag the man into a mess like this? As Pedro stood in the empty corridor, torn between fear and hope, one thing became clear. Carlos wasn't going to stop. If Pedro didn't find a solution fast, his mother's life and his own would be in serious danger. How will Pedro handle this new threat? Can he trust Edouard to help him? Or is he on his own? Pedro's heart pounded against his ribs as Carlos shoved him back toward the wall, the rough concrete scraping his skin through his thin shirt. Carlos's grin was razor sharp, eyes glittering with sadistic amusement, asterisk. "Thought you could hide from me, didn't you?" Carlos sneered, tightening his grip on Pedro's collar. His goons loomed behind him, their presence adding weight to the threat. Pedro's hands clenched into fists. His pulse roared in his ears, a mixture of anger and fear swirling inside him. He had nothing left to give Carlos. His mother's life depended on every penny he earned, and he couldn't afford to lose any more. "I told you," Pedro managed, his voice hoarse. "I don't have anything for you." Carlos's grin widened. "Oh, I believe you, kid, but that's not my problem. If you don't pay up, your mom pays the price. And I don't think you want that, do you?" Pedro's body tensed, his jaw locking. He needed a way out, fast. But Carlos was a predator, and predators didn't let their prey go easily. Carlos leaned in closer, his breath hot and rancid on Pedro's face. "You've got two choices," he whispered. "You either find the money, or I pay your sweet mama a little visit." Pedro's heart sank, rage boiling beneath his helplessness. "Leave her alone," he snapped, his voice cracking. Carlos only laughed, a low, cruel sound. He pulled Pedro's collar tighter, making the boy stumble forward. "You've got until the end of the week," Carlos hissed. "Miss my deadline, and she'll regret it." Just as Pedro thought he might suffocate under the weight of his fear, a calm, commanding voice rang out from behind them. "Let him go, now." Pedro turned toward the voice, his heart skipping a beat. Standing at the edge of the sidewalk, as composed as ever, was Edouard. Behind him, two security guards from the building flanked his sides, their expressions unreadable but their postures tense. Edouard looked different tonight. There was no trace of the warmth Pedro was used to. His eyes were cold, his expression as sharp as a blade. Carlos glanced at Edouard, barely hiding his annoyance. "And who the hell are you supposed to be?" Edouard stepped forward, closing the distance between them slowly, deliberately. His gaze never left Carlos. "I'm someone," Edouard said quietly, "who can make your life a nightmare in less than 24 hours. Carlos scoffed, though there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "Is that so?" Edouard gave the faintest smile, a smile without warmth. "You know the name Edouard Alves?" he asked, his voice smooth but carrying weight. Carlos blinked, the name clearly ringing a bell. Edouard let the silence stretch just long enough for it to sink in. "I own this building," Edouard continued, his tone sharp as a razor. "And I know exactly who you are, Carlos." The gangster's bravado faltered, and his grip on Pedro loosened slightly. His goons exchanged uneasy glances. They could feel the shift in power, too. "You think you can pull this kind of stunt here?" Edouard asked, his eyes narrowing. "On my property?" Carlos clenched his jaw, struggling to maintain his cocky demeanor. "I don't care who you are, old man." Edouard took another step forward, close enough now that his voice dropped to a low, deliberate tone. "Here's what's going to happen," Edouard said. "You and your boys are going to walk away, right now, or I'll make one phone call, and you won't see daylight again for a very long time." Carlos's eyes flickered with hesitation. He was weighing his options, trying to decide if Edouard was bluffing. But something in Edouard's gaze, the cold certainty, told Carlos he wasn't. The two security guards stepped forward, ready to act at Edouard's signal. Pedro watched, his heart still racing, as Carlos's confidence cracked. The gangster might have ruled the streets, but this was a different playing field, and Edouard held all the cards. Carlos let out a frustrated breath, releasing Pedro's collar with a shove. "This isn't over, kid," he muttered, glaring at Pedro. But the threat lacked its usual bite. Carlos was already retreating. Edouard didn't take his eyes off Carlos as he backed away, motioning for his goons to follow him. The three men melted into the shadows, their presence evaporating as quickly as it had arrived. Pedro stood frozen for a moment, stunned by how quickly the situation had shifted. "Are you okay?" Edouard's voice was calm, but there was an undercurrent of concern. Pedro nodded shakily, brushing off his shirt. Yeah, I'm okay." Edouard studied him for a moment, as if gauging the truth of his words. Then, with a small nod, he turned to one of the security guards. "Make sure those three don't come near this building again," Edouard ordered quietly. The guard gave a short nod and stepped away, pulling out a phone as he moved. Pedro shifted awkwardly, still trying to process what had just happened. I don't know how to thank you," he mumbled. Edouard smiled, though it was faint, almost tired. "You don't need to thank me, Pedro. I told you. I won't let anything happen to you." Pedro lowered his gaze, guilt stirring in his chest. "He's not going to stop," Pedro whispered. "Carlos, he's not going to leave us alone." Edouard's expression darkened for a moment, a shadow passing over his face. But then, just as quickly, It was gone, replaced by the same calm confidence Pedro had come to rely on. "He won't be a problem," Edouard said, the certainty in his voice undeniable. "I'll make sure of it." Pedro wanted to believe him. He needed to believe him. But as they stood together on the quiet sidewalk, Pedro couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. Carlos wasn't the type to walk away without a fight. And Pedro knew all too well how dangerous desperate men could be. Edouard placed a reassuring hand on Pedro's shoulder. "Let's get you home. We'll figure this out." Pedro nodded, though his thoughts were still tangled with fear and doubt. Edouard had saved him tonight, but how long could this fragile peace last? Why is Edouard so determined to protect Pedro, no matter the risk? And what price will they both pay for standing up to Carlos? With Carlos behind bars, the world seemed to shift. Pedro no longer had to look over his shoulder. For the first time in what felt like forever, he and his mother could breathe freely. Every morning, Pedro visited Mrs. Clara at the clinic, watching her grow stronger day by day. The color returned to her cheeks, her smile came easier, and her laughter, soft but genuine, reminded Pedro of better days. He had kept his promise. They had survived, and now life was slowly falling into place. Pedro's focus turned back to his studies and the job at Edouard's company. School, once an afterthought, now felt like a gateway to a future he could control. At work, Edouard continued to guide him, not just as a boss, but as someone Pedro could trust. Yet, despite his gratitude, a nagging thought lingered in Pedro's mind. Why? Why had Edouard helped him so much, going beyond what anyone else would? It wasn't just the money or the protection. It was the personal investment Edouard made in Pedro's life. Pedro could feel it. The man wasn't just doing charity work. It was something deeper. But what was Edouard hiding? Pedro's curiosity finally got the better of him one late afternoon. As they sat in Edouard's office, the two had fallen into a familiar routine. Edouard would call Pedro in to talk, offer him small bits of advice about school, work, and life. Today, Pedro sat across from him at the sleek desk, flipping through a report Edouard had asked him to review. But his mind wasn't on the paper in front of him. Edouard noticed. "You seem distracted today," he said, leaning back in his chair. Pedro hesitated, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of the report. "I've just been thinking." Edouard raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "About what?" Pedro looked down for a moment, gathering his thoughts. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful. "Why did you help me? I mean, really, why go through all this trouble for me and my mom?" Edouard's expression didn't change, but Pedro noticed a subtle shift in his body language, his shoulders tensing just slightly, as if he had expected the question but hoped it wouldn't come so soon. "I've told you, Pedro. I see potential in you," Edouard said, his voice steady. Pedro shook his head. "I know, but it's more than that. It's not just about potential, is it?" Edouard was silent for a moment, his gaze flickering as if he was debating something internally. Then, with a small sigh, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "You're right," Edouard admitted. "It's not just about your potential. There's more to it." Pedro waited, his heart beating faster. Finally, he was going to get answers. Edouard's eyes softened, and for the first time, Pedro saw something in them that surprised him. Vulnerability. "When I was your age," Edouard began, "I wasn't much different from you. My mother was sick too, and I had no one to turn to. I did everything I could to keep us afloat, but I made mistakes." Pedro sat up straighter, hanging on every word. "Mistakes that cost me more than I ever thought they would," Edouard continued, his voice quieter now, as if he were speaking to himself as much as to Pedro. "I got involved with people like Carlos, dangerous people, and it took me years to escape that life." Pedro's mind raced. Edouard had been in his shoes. The calm, composed man sitting in front of him had once faced the same struggles, and somehow he had made it out. Edouard leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. When I saw you standing on that corner, selling sweets to take care of your mom, I saw myself. And I knew I couldn't let you make the same mistakes I did." Pedro's throat tightened. He had never imagined that Edward's kindness had come from a place of personal experience. It made everything make sense now. The protectiveness, the urgency, the unwavering support. "So you helped me because you didn't have anyone to help you?" Pedro asked quietly. Edward nodded. "Something like that. I made a promise to myself a long time ago. If I ever got out, I'd help someone else avoid the same traps. I couldn't save the kid I used to be, but I can save you." The room fell silent for a moment as Pedro absorbed everything Edward had said. There were no more doubts now. Edward's help wasn't about charity. It was about redemption. Pedro swallowed hard, feeling a wave of emotions he couldn't quite name. "Thank you," he whispered. Edward gave him a small, almost sad smile. "You don't have to thank me, Pedro. Just do your part. Stay on the right path. That's all I ask." Pedro nodded. "I will. I promise." Edward leaned forward again, his expression serious. "There's one more thing you need to understand." Pedro looked at him, waiting. "The choices you make from here on out will define your future," Edward said. "It won't be easy. Even with Carlos gone, the world won't always be kind to you. But if you stay focused, if you keep moving forward, you'll build a life you can be proud of." Pedro absorbed those words, feeling the weight of them settle in his chest. It was a warning, but also a promise. He straightened in his chair, determination blooming inside him. "I won't let you down," Pedro said firmly. Edward's eyes gleamed with approval. "I know you won't." Over the next few weeks, things continued to improve. Pedro threw himself into his studies and his work with renewed energy, determined to make good on the opportunities Edward had given him. Every day felt like a step toward the life he had once only dreamed of. And yet, even as Pedro built his new future, a question lingered at the back of his mind. What had Edward sacrificed to get where he was? There was still so much Pedro didn't know about the man who had changed his life. Edward's past, his mistakes, and the people he had crossed paths with. Those stories remained hidden. But Pedro knew one thing for certain. Edward had given him a chance. And now it was up to Pedro to make sure that chance wasn't wasted. As Pedro sat at his desk one evening, finishing up a school assignment, his phone buzzed with a message from Edward. "Let's meet tomorrow. There's something important we need to discuss." Pedro's heart skipped a beat. What could it be? Another opportunity? Or something more? He stared at the message for a moment, curiosity swirling in his mind. Edward had given him so much, but was there more he wasn't telling Pedro? What will Edward reveal next? And what new responsibilities will Pedro have to face? Pedro sat in Edward's office, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the sleek, modern furniture. Edward had called him in for a conversation, but the tone was different this time. There was no casual small talk, no light encouragement. Instead, Edward leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady, as if he were preparing to share something that weighed heavily on him. "Pedro," Edward began slowly, folding his hands on the desk in front of him. "It's time I tell you something I should have shared earlier." Pedro leaned forward, sensing that what was about to be said would change things. Edward exhaled, his expression softening in a way Pedro hadn't seen before. The mask of control slipped for a moment, revealing something deeper beneath. Regret, perhaps, or even pain. "I wasn't always the man you see sitting in front of you," Edward confessed. "I was just like you once, a kid with nothing. My mother was sick, too, and like you, I did whatever I could to survive. I faced people like Carlos, men who thrive on fear, who think they own you the moment you show weakness." Pedro's stomach tightened as Edward's words settled in. He hadn't imagined Edward ever being vulnerable, ever struggling in the way Pedro had. The polished businessman across from him had once fought the same battles. "I know what it's like to feel trapped," Edward continued, his voice low but steady. I know how the world can close in on you when you're desperate. How every choice feels like the wrong one, and you keep moving just so you don't fall apart. Pedro swallowed hard, his chest tightening with emotion. He had never heard Edouard speak like this before, with such raw honesty. But I got lucky, Edouard said, a trace of a smile flickering at the corner of his mouth. One day, someone gave me a chance. Someone believed in me when I didn't even believe in myself. And that changed everything. Pedro sat in silence, absorbing every word. He had always known Edouard was different, more than just a businessman who offered charity. But this was deeper. It was personal. Edouard leaned forward slightly, resting his arms on the desk. His gaze met Pedro's, sharp and unwavering. When I saw you on that street corner, selling sweets to take care of your mother, I saw myself in you, and I knew I couldn't walk away. Pedro's throat tightened, and he looked down for a moment, overwhelmed by the weight of Edouard's story. Edouard's voice softened. I promised myself a long time ago that if I ever made it out, I'd help someone else avoid the mistakes I made. Someone gave me that chance, and I promised I'd pass it on. Pedro felt a strange mix of emotions swirl inside him. Gratitude, humility, and something close to awe. For so long, he had wondered why Edouard had taken such a deep interest in him, why he had gone so far to protect him. Now, everything made sense. Edouard leaned back again, giving Pedro a small, knowing smile. And now, Pedro, it's your turn. Pedro blinked, confused. My turn. Edouard nodded. Yes, you've been given a chance. Something a lot of kids in your situation never get. But what you do with it, that's up to you. Pedro felt the weight of Edouard's words settle over him. This wasn't just about surviving anymore. It wasn't just about getting through the next day, the next month, or even the next year. Edouard was asking him to think beyond the present, to imagine a future that could be different, better. I don't know if I can do what you did, Pedro admitted quietly. Edouard gave him a patient smile. You don't have to know yet, but you do need to make a choice, Pedro. You've already proven you can survive. Now you have to decide how you're going to live. Pedro sat back in the chair, his mind racing. How do I want to live? The question felt enormous, almost too big to answer. For so long, he had focused only on keeping his mother safe and staying out of Carlos's reach. Now, with the danger behind him, the possibilities ahead seemed both thrilling and terrifying. Edouard studied him for a moment, sensing the boy's hesitation. You don't have to figure it all out today, Edouard said gently, but you do need to take the first step. Pedro nodded slowly, the beginnings of understanding dawning in his mind. What's the first step? Edouard's smile widened just a little. Keep learning, keep working, stay curious about the world, and most importantly, help others when you can. Pedro tilted his head, confused. Help others. Yes. Edouard leaned forward again, his tone serious. Because no matter how far you go, no matter what success you find, none of it means anything if you don't give it back. That's how you honor the people who helped you along the way. Pedro felt the words settle deep within him, stirring something he couldn't quite name. This was more than just advice. It was a blueprint for the future Edouard wanted him to build. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The room felt heavy with meaning, with the unspoken understanding between two people who had lived through things that couldn't be easily explained. Finally, Edouard stood, signaling the end of the conversation. Think about what I said, Pedro. You have time. But remember, your future starts now. Pedro rose to his feet, feeling both the weight of Edouard's expectations and the strange comfort of knowing he wasn't alone. For the first time in a long time, the future didn't seem so impossible. As he turned to leave, Edouard called out to him one last time. And Pedro? Pedro paused at the door, glancing back. I'm proud of you. The words hit Pedro harder than he expected. No one had ever said those words to him before. He swallowed the lump in his throat and nodded. Thank you, Edouard. That night, As Pedro lay awake in bed, Eduard's words echoed in his mind. "It's your turn. You've proven you can survive. Now decide how you're going to live." It was a choice he hadn't expected, but it was one he knew he couldn't ignore. What kind of life would he build now that the danger was behind him? And how could he repay the kindness and trust Eduard had shown him? These questions swirled in Pedro's mind as he drifted off to sleep, knowing that the answers wouldn't come easily. But for the first time, he wasn't afraid of the uncertainty, because now the future was his to shape. What new challenges will Pedro face? How will he take the lessons Eduard taught him and turn them into action? Years had passed, and Pedro stood at the podium in a packed event hall, wearing a crisp suit that fit him perfectly. The crowd of employees, investors, and guests watched him in respectful silence. At the edge of the stage, Eduard stood proudly, his arms crossed, a rare but unmistakable warmth in his expression. It was Pedro's moment, a moment that had been years in the making. Pedro took a slow breath, steadying himself as the weight of the occasion settled over him. He glanced at the speech prepared on the podium in front of him, but he knew he wouldn't need it. His voice, when he spoke, was clear and steady. "If I'm standing here today, it's because someone believed in me when no one else did." The crowd sat in rapt attention as Pedro's words hung in the air. He paused, scanning the faces before him. Young employees with dreams not so different from the ones he had once carried. People who had fought their own battles to reach this moment. Pedro continued, "There was a time when I thought survival was all I'd ever know. I lived day to day, just trying to get by, convinced that nothing would ever change. But then, someone gave me a chance." His eyes found Eduard at the edge of the stage. The older man gave him a small nod, one that spoke of quiet pride, shared history, and unspoken understanding. "That chance saved my life," Pedro said, his voice thick with emotion. "It gave me hope when I didn't have any. And more than that, it taught me that none of us get to where we are alone. We all need someone to believe in us." The crowd stirred, and Pedro saw nods of agreement. They understood. Maybe not all of them fully, but some had been in his shoes before. Some knew how it felt to fight for a chance, to carry the weight of impossible odds on their shoulders. Pedro's heart swelled with emotion as he spoke his next words. "And now, it's my turn to give back, my turn to be the person who believes in someone else." The audience broke into applause, but Pedro wasn't finished. He raised a hand, and the room quickly quieted again. "This is just a beginning," Pedro said, his voice steady and filled with determination. "Because kindness isn't just about changing one life. It's about starting a cycle, a chain of hope that keeps growing, so that each person helped becomes the one who helps the next." He smiled, a genuine smile born of everything he had lived through, everything he had overcome. "And I promise you all this. I won't stop here. I will keep passing it on, just as someone did for me." The applause came louder this time, a standing ovation that filled the room with energy and hope. Pedro stepped back from the podium, his heart full. The journey had been long, and it hadn't been easy, but he was here now, standing not just for himself, but for every person who would come after him. Eduard approached him, his eyes shining with pride. He placed a hand on Pedro's shoulder and leaned in just enough for the words to be heard over the applause. "I'm proud of you, Pedro." Pedro's throat tightened, but he managed to smile. "Thank you, Eduard, for everything." Eduard gave him a knowing look. "You don't need to thank me anymore. This," he gestured toward the audience, "this is your moment. You earned it." Pedro nodded, and the two men stood side by side, watching the applause continue. It was a shared victory, a testament to everything they had fought for. Later that evening, as the crowd dispersed and the lights in the hall dimmed, Pedro found a moment to himself. He stood near the back of the room, watching people chat and laugh as they left the ceremony. Eduard joined him, 2 glasses of sparkling water in hand. He offered one to Pedro, who accepted it with a small smile. "You've come a long way," Eduard said quietly. Pedro chuckled, So have you. Edouard gave a slight shrug. Maybe. But tonight isn't about me. It's about you and what comes next. Pedro turned to him, his smile fading slightly. What does come next? Edouard's expression was thoughtful, his gaze distant for a moment. Then he smiled, as if he already knew the answer. That's up to you. The future is in your hands now. Pedro nodded slowly, understanding the weight of Edouard's words. He was no longer just a kid selling sweets on the street. He had become someone with the power to change lives, and now it was his responsibility to use that power wisely. Do you think, Pedro began, hesitating for a moment, do you think I can really do for someone else what you did for me? Edouard smiled, his eyes kind but certain. I don't think you can, Pedro. He clinked his glass gently against Pedro's. I know you will. As the last guest filed out of the hall, Pedro and Edouard stood in the quiet, the glow of the evening's success still lingering in the air. I wonder who it will be, Pedro said, half to himself. Edouard raised an eyebrow. Who what will be? Pedro smiled, a small but determined smile. The next person, the next one who needs a chance. Edouard clapped him on the back, a low chuckle escaping him. You'll know when you find them. Pedro nodded, feeling a sense of peace settle over him. The cycle would continue. The kindness Edouard had shown him wouldn't stop with this moment. It would grow, pass down from one person to the next. He could feel it now, the quiet certainty that the story wasn't over. It was just the beginning of something much larger. And somewhere out there, another kid, scared, lost, and desperate, was waiting for someone to believe in them. Who will be the next Pedro? The cycle of kindness continues, and with it, the promise that no one's story ends in darkness, because there will always be someone ready to light the way. If you've made it this far, then subscribe to the channel and leave a comment.